their Irish military ancestors. And just a quick background on David Ryan. He has a master's degree of art in genealogy and is a genealogist and an oral historian from Cork City, Ireland. He specializes in assisting people in researching their Irish family history. And with no further ado, we'll turn the time to Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I hope it's a lovely day wherever you are. I just want to state for direct where I begin that I am not a military historian. That's really what I'm doing with this is just giving you kind of a brief overview of where you can find some information on Irish ancestors and their military service. Now, there'll be three topics I hope to cover. I'm going to briefly look at Irish who served in the American Civil War, those who fought in World War One, particularly as part of the British Army, and then finally I will look at the Irish War of Independence, which followed the First World War. Now, and when it comes to the American Civil War, there are others who can talk about this in way more detail. So I'm only going to give like a very brief overview. Now, there was certainly a massive Irish contribution to the American Civil War. So you had 7 Union generals who were born in Ireland, 6 Confederate generals. There were estimated to be roughly 180,000 who fought for the Union during the war, and then 20,000 who fought for the Confederacy. And note that I said Irish American simply because it can be difficult at this period to determine exactly how many were Irish born and how many were of Irish parentage. And also, a large percentage of the Union Navy were Irish born. So you can see there's certainly a massive Irish involvement in the conflict on both sides. And actually, we have here. So in some sense, it wasn't just a war between American states. That quite often the Irish ended up fighting each other on opposite sides of the conflict. So you had two men, I think, who demonstrate that perfectly. They were Thomas Francis Maher and John Mitchell. They'd been both involved in the Young Ireland, otherwise known as the Fenian Rebellion of 1848. They were deported from Ireland, spent some time in Australia before ending up in the United States. And Maher ended up as a general on the Union side, whereas Mitchell and joined the Confederacy. Now, you might ask ourselves, well, why did the Irish get involved in this conflict, especially in a country that wasn't theirs, that they were relatively recent arrivals too, and where they weren't always looked on favorably? Well, financial, certainly always a big incentive for military service. A lot of these men would have been quite poor after they emigrated, and maybe they didn't think the war would last that long. They would just be, chance to make a quick buck, as it were. And then certainly there was also a desire to integrate, to be accepted as American. There was certainly a belief in cause, and this goes as much for those on the Confederate side as it does for those in the Union. I'm certainly a big believer that when it comes to our ancestors, we should be aware that sometimes they held beliefs which we would certainly not agree with nowadays. They were people of their time just as we are of ours. And then certainly there were also some who held political ambitions. They felt that by serving with either army, that maybe they could advance in American society, that they, some those who served in the Union Army, especially, went on to, went on to achieve political office, and others as well maybe hoped that serving would allow them to build up military experience, which they may later use for freeing Ireland from British control. Oh, and the interesting thing is, we often assume that immigration at this time was one way that all of those Irish who emigrated to the United States at the time stayed there, but there were actually quite a few who came back. And interestingly enough, there is this example from the 1901 Irish census. And you have a Mitchell B. Drew living on Georgia Street in Cork City, who was listed as a US naval pensioner. And there were certainly there were quite a few. And there's even a bar not far from where I live called the Cotton Ball, and that was founded by a veteran of the Union Army during the Civil War. So you never know what type of surprises you will find in these records. Now I want to move on to talking about the First World War, and this will be primarily focused on those Irish who served with the British Army. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about US military records. And also I felt that there would be others who'd be talking at RootsTech who would be able to go into much more detail on that side of things. Now, there were certainly at least 206,000 Irish who served as part of the British Army during the First World War, and these were both nationalist and unionist backgrounds. Nationalists were those who wanted an Irish parliament to represent Irish interests. Unionists were those who were happy with the current situation of direct rule from Westminster. They didn't want to change. They saw them, they identified themselves as British and were worried that the creation of an Irish parliament would lead to them losing out. It should also be stressed that the Irish who fought in First World War for the British Army were voluntary recruits. There was no conscription in Ireland at this time. There have been attempts to introduce this towards kind of around 1917, because there were worries that the war was dragging on. They weren't getting enough recruits, but after a lot of opposition, it's didn't happen. And of course, then there were many other Irish who were serving with the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Pretty much any country in the world that was considered part of the Allied side during the conflict would have had Irish serving with us. I believe there probably were some Irish with the on the side of Germany, but these would have been extremely small. It would mainly have been those who probably had some sort of Irish ancestry. The exact number of Irish casualties is disputed. Some estimate it to be much, much higher. Some say it was lower. And like I was saying with the American Civil War, sometimes it can just be quite difficult to figure out, trying to define, well, who was Irish? Do you just say, oh, well, those who were born in Irish, who enlisted in Ireland? Or do you classify all of those who maybe, had an Irish surname or recent Irish ancestry? But certainly, the current estimate is at about 40,000. So it was an absolutely devastating conflict from that point of view. There were, because of simply the level of Irish enlistment in the war, there were, Irish regiments were created. You can see a list of them here, and I probably missed a few because I'm not counting those who were with other allied armies. But I think this just gives maybe a sense of just the scale of Irish enlistment in the conflict. Now, a lot of people may wonder, well, why did the Irish serve? What possible reason could they have had for supporting the British in the war? Why didn't they go over to other side? We should be aware that circumstances in 1914 were very different than they were, less than a decade later. Certainly, like almost all armed conflicts, financial was a major incentive. The fact that, they were promised a pension, regular pay, which they could send home to their family. These are big motivators, especially for those from poor working class backgrounds. There was also a desire for adventure. There was relatively little mobility in Ireland at the time. It's not like nowadays where you can hop on a plane and find yourself on the opposite side of the world within a few hours. Many may not have even gone beyond the nearest large town. So certainly, the idea of adventure was a big incentive. Then, of course, there was also a tradition of family service in British Armed Forces. Certainly, many Irish would have had other relatives who had served before them, or maybe they also had friends who had served and thought, okay, this will be a chance to, see more of them. Politics played a large role in it. Ireland at this time, the political divide was over mainly down to the whole issue of home rule. That pretty much since the mid 1800s, a lot of Irish had been, advocating to try and get an Irish Parliament to handle Irish affairs restored. And then there were those primarily in the northeast, in what is now Northern Ireland, who didn't want that, who wanted things to remain as they were. And both sides hoped that by enlisting in the conflict, that they'd be able to show their loyalty and that Britain would support them. Then, of course, there was also a lot of the propaganda focused on, the plight of countries like Belgium, which the Irish, being another small Catholic country, the Irish had felt they had a lot in common with, and they, I just kind of felt that, if we don't stand up for countries like Belgium, maybe we'll be next. We should do our part. And certainly, propaganda was also a major thing. I mean, some of these recruitment posters might look a bit cliched to us nowadays. Particularly the second one. Obviously, but you can see, like Belgium there in the background. So what I've been saying in my previous slide about this whole thing of supporting small countries. So this sort of propaganda was certainly very effective. And Sky, the other poster, Sergeant Michael O'Leary, he was originally from Cork, but he toured the country giving speeches about, this is what it's really like on the front. This is why you are needed. So he was a very effective propaganda tool. And I should stress that the very idea of full Irish independence from Britain, that was only held by a very small minority at the time. Most people were quite happy being part of Britain, but they just wanted kind of, more say in how things were done. What sort of sources are there available for those who fought in the First World War? So you've service records, medal cards, registered soldiers' effects, soldiers' wills, regimental diaries, and war memorial. The service records where they survived do contain quite a lot of information. I believe there are fairly similar records kept in the United States, because of course you also have the draft records. But I said, we don't have, there was no draft for Irish troops. Unfortunately, the majority of British World War One service records were lost in 1940 when a German bomb fell on the warehouse that they were kept in. And you can kind of, you can see the scorch damage on this record here. Fortunately, even though we are missing the service records, there are other records which can help fill in some of the gaps. So the medal cards, especially, because they will actually tell you when did a soldier enlist based on which medal they were given. Because basically, like, if they signed up in 1914, they were given a specific medal for that. If it was in 1915, so basically, like, each year they served, they got a new medal. There were certain medals given for which part of the world they were serving in. All of this, so those medals can help fill in some of the gaps. Now, then, for those soldiers who died, you will get registered soldiers' effects, and this is quite important because it tells you, it gives their service number, it tells you when did they die, where, and who the who basically any back pay owed to them and any of their effects who was giving you. So usually it was whoever was listed in their when they enlisted, whoever was their next of kin. So usually would be a family member, either a spouse or a sibling. Usually, as I said, the date of their death, and then maybe the place, and occasionally maybe a few other. So payments, widows got first dibs, and if they weren't married, then it usually went to a parent or sibling. Now, this is a source that a lot of people aren't aware of because it's not up on Ancestry or Full Tree. These are only kept in the National Archives of Ireland. There are roughly 9,000 of these, and they are from all parts of Ireland, because Ireland was one single entity at the time. And the will was extremely short. They didn't have that much space. I just said, if I were to die, this is who my effects will go to. And it can be actually quite useful to compare this against maybe the sort of the register of soldiers' effects, and the fact that would have a bit of information on to actually give it to. So you can see for this soldier here, or Ryan, it actually goes to it actually went to his brother, who was serving, Sergeant James Ryan, who was serving with the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Irish Police Force at the time. And through that, you can actually trace back more of the family. And I'll be talking a bit more about the RIC in a few minutes. Regimental diaries, these were a source that I wasn't even aware of until a few years back. They're not personal diaries; these are for their particular unit. Sometimes they'll mention, awards given out to individual soldiers. Sometimes they don't tell you that much, but other times they will actually give you quite a lot of information, particularly when it comes to, talking about casualty. So if you know that soldier you're researching died on a certain date, you can go to the regiment diary, you can go through it, and maybe then try and figure out, okay, when did he, what were the circumstances behind his death? And also, the fact that there are maps, allows you a certain degree of context. Now, memorials. Pretty much every Irish soldier who died and who served in, either the First or Second World War will be commemorated as part of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. You can go to their website, you can put in the name of a soldier and see if it comes up. There are, of course, also many local memorials throughout Ireland, particularly in the cities and large towns. So, the first slide I had for World War One showed the memorial here in Cork. Some of these are better maintained than others. You will find, especially within the Anglican Church of Ireland, that they have quite a lot of war memorials. For some reason, the Catholic Church didn't really erect that many war memorials. You should also be aware, though, that war memorials are a secondary source. Sometimes there will actually be inaccurate information on them. I was doing some research for a friend a few years back. He had a great uncle who died in World War One. He knew the regiment he was part of, but and even though he was listed on the memorial for that regiment, he simply, he died in a separate place than where the regiment was at the time. And it turned out that he and some other soldiers who had been part of the communications division were transferred to another regiment briefly at the time of his death. So sometimes there can be, because there are so many soldiers to keep track of, sometimes there can be a mix-up and they may end up on the wrong memorial. Oh, the Irish War of Independence. This I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, because I think this is something that a lot of people, they probably know the basics of it. They may have seen the movie Michael Collins or The Wind That Shakes the Barley. But although those are good movies, they're not necessarily historically accurate, especially Michael Collins. So, apologies to any of you who are fans of that movie. Now, what should we know about the War of Independence? Because I think it puzzles people sometimes, wonder, why was there so much Irish enlistment in the First World War, but then suddenly only a few years later, Ireland is in very much open rebellion against British war? Well, the Rising in 1916 played a big part in that. Basically, in Easter 1916, group belonging to the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and the Irish Citizens Army staged a week-long uprising in the middle of Dublin, and there were a few other smaller uprisings elsewhere. The rebellion was eventually put down. A lot of the center of Dublin was in flames afterwards. But of course, the British miscalculated in some respects, because they by executing many of the leaders who had been, involved in the rising, it actually led to growing sympathy for their cause. The issue of conscription also played a part. I said there was no conscription in Ireland. There was an attempt to introduce it, but the Irish political party Sinn Féin, who by this point had become kind of the biggest advocates for full Irish independence, separate from Britain, they were able to use the conscription issue to boost their own profile. And the more moderate Irish Parliamentary Party were seen as being slow to condemn this issue. Then, of course, you also had the formation of the Irish Republican Army by Dáil Éireann. This, sort of like a gradual merging of the Irish Volunteers and some of the other groups who've been involved in 1916. Now, and the Irish Weapons didn't. It's sort of officially seen as beginning in 1919 with the shooting of two policemen in Solohead Beg in County Tipperary on the very same day that the first Dáil, the Irish, newly independent breakaway Irish Parliament was meeting. But it took time for the Ireland conflict to really take off properly. So initially, it's at the time, the IRA did not have a lot of weapons because it was quite difficult to, with Ireland being patrolled by the British Navy, it was quite difficult to import arms. So, what they did was they started raiding the police barracks in order to, to get weaponry from them. And then eventually it moved beyond just raiding the barracks for weaponry, but actually launching guerrilla attacks on police and military. And the war going, there was no, this wasn't like the, American Revolution where you had, two armies lined up facing each other, shooting. It was, I said it was a guerrilla campaign. And that made it quite difficult for the British forces to respond. So often what would happen is that the IRA would launch an ambush on a British patrol. British forces would say, okay, well, we know who was behind this. We can't get to them, but we know where their family live. So we will burn that family out of their home. Or maybe they would launch a raid on, searching for weapons on, where they were believed to be hiding. They'd arrest those they saw as sympathizers. And then, the IRA would respond. It would just go sort of round and round. So that's what made the Irish War of Independence, even though it was relatively short, quite gruesome in a lot of ways. Of course, this was an example of what reprisals could look like. So on the 11th and 12th of December 1920, members of the K Company Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary rampaged through Cork and began looting and burning businesses on Patrick Street. That is the main street in Cork City. And the burning was officially in reprisals for an IRA ambush elsewhere in the city, kind of earlier last week, which had left a number of auxiliaries wounded and one dead. And often when this period is talked about, we talk about the savagery of British troops. But I think as we maybe see with modern military serving in places like the Middle East. You're you're a young man. You've been dispatched to this area. It seems like almost you know attacks could your attackers, they don't wear uniforms, they blend in with the civilian population. You don't know exactly where the next attack is going to come from, and that can lead to a lot of these reprisals and violence because the soldiers are they're lashing out at an enemy who they can't see. But Bernie of Cork was just one example of what could happen as a result of this. Now, I've made reference already to some of those who were involved in conflict. So you had the Irish Republican Army. They were formed out of the Irish Volunteers and some of the others who had been involved in 1916. On paper, they claimed a total strength of 70,000, but only a tiny fraction of that were actively engaged in combat. I'm sure there were similar issues during the American Revolutionary War that you would have had, when the conflict was almost done, you would have had plenty sort of, flocking to sign up to in hopes of getting a pension later or just by saying that, they served. So at first, when the conflict first broke out, they were really only up against the police force in Ireland, the Royal Irish Constabulary, and those British forces already based in Ireland. Because again, the whole thing really came as a surprise to the British government. They were distracted by problems elsewhere in the British Empire, particularly in after the First World War. The empire was in turmoil. There were a lot of the other colonies were looking for independence or greater self-determination. So they still weren't really paying attention to Ireland. And then what happened is that as the conflict got more bloody, there were a lot of those within the RIC who were just simply resigning because they hadn't, they felt that they weren't equipped for this conflict, or they didn't want to be responsible for fighting other Irishmen. Now, the British government didn't want to admit that there was a war, so they said, okay, we'll just, we'll recruit British ex-servicemen to act as support for the RIC. So on paper, they would be down as police. They would be paid the same as the police. No one wants to say, these are British troops. And that, was what created a lot of the problems and a lot of the violence, because these were soldiers. They weren't trained for a policing role. And oftentimes they were just simply not told what to expect in Ireland. The official line was that, the IRA are just thieves and murderers. They're not really a military. You'll mop them up within a few months and everything will go back to normal. Here you can see an image of the Irish Republican Army. I said, the IRA at this time was a guerrilla army. Last time they operated in flying columns, which allowed them to move about much more. So, that way they could kind of, avoid British patrols, or they could maybe even, if, say, maybe the IRA in North Cork was planning a big attack, they could, kind of move down and join up with them. The IRA, it borrowed a lot from the British Army command structure. Part of this was because many of those who were at a high level within the IRA had been veterans of the British Army during the First World War. So they are pushing what they learned and using it against the British. Some IRA companies were bigger than others. Then you had, battalions, and then they'd be grouped into brigades depending on the size of the county. So some place like Cork might have some 3 or 4 brigades because it's, biggest county. And then, other counties may only have one, or maybe you might even have 2 counties which were just covered by one single brigade. And as I said, here you can see a good map of how the IRA was organized at this time. Now, the Royal Irish Constabulary were the main opposition at this time. They were the police force in Ireland. They're actually, they were actually divided into 2 groups because you had the Royal Irish Constabulary in most of the countries, and then Dublin had its own police force, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The RIC were armed, the Dublin Metropolitan Police weren't for some strange reason. I say, a lot of those within the Royal Irish Constabulary, particularly within rank and file, were Irish Catholics. They probably would have been, considered themselves moderate nationalists. And it was only within sort of, the higher ranks that you would have found a lot of Protestant Unionists. Now, the Black and Tans are the ones who I think have the worst reputation, especially in history. There's sort of this myth that, they were all ex-convicts recruited directly from British prisons. No, most of them were simply ex-British servicemen, would have been sort of rank and file. Quite a lot of them were of Irish ancestry, or possibly maybe even, had been born in Ireland themselves. So they were, recruited at the rank of constable just to beef up the ranks of the RIC. The term Black and Tan, the nickname given to them, was simply because of their uniform, that at the time there was a shortage of typical RIC uniform. So they were given, black pants and khaki shirt. Then you have the auxiliaries. The auxiliaries would have been former officers. They were obviously paid quite a lot more. And when we talk about sort of, the reputation of the Black and Tans, it's really the auxiliaries we should be talking about, because the auxiliaries were really, directly kind of appointed as a counterinsurgency force with orders to do whatever it took to end the conflict. There are quite a lot of sources. I'm aware that we are running low on time, so I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Real military history, these is an oral histories collected from veterans of the conflict. There are, unfortunately, some limits to it. As I said, it leaves out many of those who took the anti-treaty side later on. You have the military service, pensions collection. I say I've underlined active service because this is one of the sticking points with the pensions. How do you define active service? Because there are many of those, especially women, who have been very involved in the conflict, who have put their lives on the line as scouts, as spies, delivering messages, etc. And they were excluded from the pension process until quite late, and even then didn't get anything near the same pension as their male counterparts did. And here you see an example of a pension record. So of course, and then of course, when it comes to the, I think I left out the slide on the constabulary, because basically, if you're looking into the constabulary, a lot of their records are on Find My Past. There is a specific section for the Royal Irish Constabulary records, and that would include all of those who served with the constabulary, not just the regular RIC, but also the Black and Tans and auxiliaries. And then, of course, post-independence, I'll be talking about this in more detail tomorrow as part of my talk on the 1922 Public Record Office fire. But, like a lot of countries that went through an independence movement, things didn't really quieten down in Ireland afterwards, because, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was negotiated in December 1921. created the Irish Free State, but this resulted in Ireland being partitioned and the creation of the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. This and other issues were eventually resulted in the outbreak of a civil war in Ireland, which ran for just less than a year. That was quite bloody, quite violent. It's followed a similar pattern to the War of Independence with a lot of insurgency and guerrilla warfare. And it was 1914 before an Irish Republic was finally officially declared. Now, if you are using the app, please feel free to leave feedback. I assume that you probably do this on the website as well. So all feedback helps, even if you feel that I didn't cover stuff that you would have liked me to. And certainly, if there are further questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me with those questions.
David, we have a number of questions in the chat.
Sure.
Would you like to address some of them?
Of course, most definitely, yes.
Donna asks, what is a flying column?
A flying column was basically like a mobile unit of the IRA during the War of Independence. The idea was that the flying columns were like I don't know if there's an equivalent in any other army of the time, but basically the flying columns were semi-independent units within the IRA structure who could move around much more freely. That they weren't just they weren't confined to one particular area.
Okay. Anita asks, hi, David, is the 1901 and 1911 Irish census keyword searchable with U.S. pensioners or similar keyword?
Well, I think, see, the problem with you could search by occupation. I think your best bet is to do a search by like individual keywords. So maybe search by pensioner, by naval, or by army, so on and so forth. Because the way they have the website set up, if you put in multiple keywords, it could you might end up getting a lot of results that you're not looking
for. Okay. Another question, can you tell me anything about what they called the White Boys?
Yeah, the White Boys were a secret society in the 1800s. They were more to do with kind of agricultural issues rather than being sort of like an ancestor of the IRA. That it was more to do with say like a local landlord evicted a family and someone else moved into that house, that the White Boys would start intimidating them, maybe damage their crops, or possibly in some cases even went much further and might have even killed them.
Okay, Megan asks, are internment records available for Irish military prisoners in the 1920s?
Yes, there are. For the 1920s, most of those would have been, some of those you'd find in, say, like the later Irish pension records. If somebody had been interned, they would have applied for a pension as part of that. I think the actual records of imprisonments would have been kept in the National Archives in the UK as part of sort of general Irish prison records at the time.
Okay. Susan asks, where are the World War One regimental diaries held?
They are, I think, are they on Ancestry or Fold Tree? It's been a while since, stuff tends to kind of sometimes move about between all the Ancestry owned websites. But I'd say start with Ancestry, and if they don't have them, try Fold Tree.
Okay. C6 says, hello, any place to find info on the War of 1812, Irishmen who served under the British?
Oh, that is a tricky one. Anything like that would be held in the either the UK National Archives or in the Imperial War Museum. But if they had been digitized, they should be available on Fold Tree. Because that tends to be kind of like the one stop for nearly all British military records.
Okay. Kelbell asks, I have an ancestor born in Cork in 1828 and came to the US in the 1850s or so. Were there any military conflicts in Ireland that he may have been involved in?
That is an issue. Like, there was a rebellion in 1848, but it was quite small, didn't really get off the ground. Um, but like most immigrants at that time, like those who were involved in those rebellions were usually rounded up, and if they weren't, executed, were usually deported to Australia. So I think if he was in the US by the 1850s, he probably wouldn't have been involved in any military conflicts here.
Okay. The question, family lore says a relative of mine was one of the 12 soldiers during the Gallipoli who survived disembarking the River Clyde and briefly captured the Stade de Bar fort. I've read countless books that say there were 12 soldiers, but never been able to find a list of names for those 12. Any ideas where I could find this information? Thank you.
Um, depending on which army they served in, I'm assuming either the British Army or Anzac. That should be available through I think the Imperial War Museum in the UK would have a lot of that information. If not, reach out to the Western Front Association. They're primarily UK based, but they have a few Irish branches, and they tend to be kind of dedicated military researchers.
Okay, D. McInernary. I have a relative whose paper trail ends in 1860s in New York City. I believe he may have served in the Civil War, but I can't find any record of him. I know many immigrants were paid to serve in the place of others. If that was the case, would they serve under their real name or a name of a person they were serving for? And how would I find the person if this
Ooh,
was the case?
that is a tough one, and I see I'm not an expert on the Civil War. I'm sure there are others who would know a lot more about that. But I think certainly, if you download the syllabus, which is you can find on the session details. I have a few links on that, and it may be worth looking through them. Certainly, there is a historian and archaeologist from Ireland, a man by the name of Damien Shields. His website, Irish in the American Civil War, has quite a lot of information. So I'd recommend having a look there, and maybe he's written something on that.
Okay, Alonzo asks, could you tell us where to find the pension records and military interviews on the military archives?
Yeah, if you go to the military, militaryarchives.ie, and up top you'll see a kind of a list of everything they have. There should be a drop down menu which will have details on all of that.
Very good. Dottie asks, what about those who served during the Mexican-American War? Was citizenship an incentive? What was the law that regulated this?
Oh, that is, see, again, I'm not particularly um up to date on that stuff, but I do know that there were, like, I don't know if there was ever like a formal law in place, or if it was just, when you're applying for naturalization, be able to see that you're an army veteran counted towards a bit more. But I do know that there was a famous Irish regiment, St. Patrick's Battalion, who actually switched sides during that conflict, and are sort of, remembered in Mexico today as the San Patricio.
Okay. Devere asks, do you have any records of Irish serving in France during the Revolution? The Winthrop book alleges that Thomas Pope died on the guillotine with the royals.
Oh, that is an interesting one. That's actually something that I'm beginning to do some research into at the moment, because I'm giving another talk in a few weeks for the UK Society of Genealogists on Irish Revolutionary ancestors. I'm not necessarily aware of, like, I know there were certainly a lot of Irish in France at this time, because France was seen as sort of like, the place to be to get a good education. So I know that there were certainly, probably would have been some Irish who were, who ended up facing the guillotine, and there would have been plenty of Irish who would have been on the side of the revolution. But that's something I said, I've only started researching that myself, because some of those who rebelled in Ireland in 1798 were directly inspired by the French Revolution. And I certainly know that there were a lot of Irish nuns in France at this time with various religious orders who ended up coming back to Ireland to escape the revolution. So it's an area that I said I've only scratched the surface of in my own research.
Okay. Janice asks, my great uncle served in the Queen's Irish Guard, killed in action. I have his service records. Can I get a picture of him? And did they fill out attestation cards? I hope to find his father's name there as a last resort.
If he was killed in action, there should be the medal card and the list of his effects, which will hopefully give some information on, may give some information on his parents. Unfortunately, because they didn't fill out a draft card like they did in the US, there isn't as much information in that regard. But it's also worth looking into, where did he enlist? If he enlisted in the UK, might he have even been, might there be other records which mention his parents?
Very good. Michael asks, my Irish relative from Kerry has a pension from the British. Was this common in 1840?
Probably would have been, because there were a lot of Irish who served either with the British Army at the time, or within the British Civil Service. And so you would have had a lot of Irish out in places like India or Australia or elsewhere in the empire. So it certainly wouldn't have been that unusual for someone to have a British pension at the time.
Okay. Evelyn asks, my grandfather from Armagh served in the British Merchant Marines. Where can I find his records?
Oh, the British Merchant Marines. Um, their records should be on Gold Tree as well. I think, if in doubt when it comes to that stuff, always check with the British National Archives, because they will usually tell you which particular website has digitized those records and has them available.
Okay. Linda asks, my ancestor served in the mid 1800s in the East India Army. Where would I access those records?
Those records, as I said, should be available on goldtree.com. Again, I don't know how detailed they are or how much survives, but it should be on Fold3 or Ancestry. And if not, check the British National Archives catalogue, because as I said, before, they will often give details on which particular website has digitized.
Okay, and Alonzo asks, how do you tell apart Irish immigrants post-immigration with very common names, i.e. John Bryan?
That's like, that's, the debate of pretty much every genealogist existent. Sometimes it comes out to, may come down just, what area did they live in? If there were a lot of other kind of typical Irish names in the area, there's a good chance they may have been Irish as well. Simply because, immigrant communities tended to stick together. So that could be sometimes that could be just the best clue that you have, absent any source of naturalization.
Okay, I don't know if this next one is a question to the group or not, but Jackie says, anyone out there know anything about the Meagher's Brigade, which was composed of the 63rd, 69th, and 88th New York Infantry Regiment? That sounds like it's a U.S. question to me.
Yeah.
I have to check the U.S. records on that one, right?
Unfortunately, yeah, that's a bit out of my area of expertise.
Very good. Let me just double check again, see if there's any more that have just come in here at the last. That looks like it. David, thank you so very much for a great presentation today.
You're welcome. As I said, if people have other follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will do what I can to answer them.